Russia just entered a red alert situation. Its increasingly desperate leader, Vladimir Putin, is scrambling. His country is gripped by panic, his cities are burning, and his economy is going up in smoke. And it's all thanks to Ukraine raining down hell on Russian infrastructure. Running out of options, the Russian president just made one of the biggest and boldest calls of the war so far. A decision that will have lasting implications one way or another, but also a decision that shows how hopeless the situation is becoming for the Kremlin. On October 22, the Russian military announced that it was calling up army reservists from across the country to defend its infrastructure on home soil. Vice Admiral Vladimir Tsimlyansky, Deputy Chief of the main Organizational and Mobilization Directorate of the Russian General Staff, otherwise known as the head of Russia's conscription office, announced the news in a televised address, and there's a lot that can be learned from what he said. The Vice Admiral started off by saying the following: "In order to increase the level of security for critical infrastructure and other facilities vital to the well-being of citizens, a decision has been made to engage the most prepared and patriotic citizens in carrying out measures to protect civilian facilities deep in Russia's territory." Already, this reveals a lot. First, it's a sign that Russia is remarkably desperate, because it would never make this kind of announcement unless it really had to. For a long time now, Putin and his Kremlin officials have been putting on a brave face in front of the public, relying on their usual tricks of lies, propaganda and truth spinning to paint a picture that the war is going well, that Russia is on the path to victory, that the economy has withstood the assault of Western sanctions, and that Ukrainian forces are on the ropes as Russian troops gain ground by the day. Of course, the rest of the world knows the truth, but within Russia itself, where large parts of the population get their news fed to them by state-owned TV channels and newspaper reports, it's relatively easy for the Kremlin to control what people believe. And it goes to great lengths to cover up the harsh realities of the conflict, masking the facts whenever and however it can. Now, however, Russia's leadership has had to openly admit that things aren't quite going to plan. They're letting the public know that Ukraine's attacks on their own infrastructure are becoming far too dangerous, and that the existing defenses simply aren't sufficient to stop Kyiv's drone strikes. They need more help, and since the army is already too busy fighting along the front lines of Ukraine, they're turning to reservists to strap on their boots and defend their homeland from future Ukrainian strikes. And that leads to the second big thing that can be learned from the Russian Vice Admiral's words: Ukraine's attacks are working. For months now, Ukraine has carried out a strategic, systematic aerial assault on the most important pieces of infrastructure over the border and across Russia's regions, paying special attention to energy and fuel-related locations. Oil refineries, fuel storage tanks and pipelines have been blown up and wiped off the map by Ukraine's precision strikes, with massive explosions ringing out and thick clouds of smoke filling the air. Fires have broken out and raged through the night, with great flames lighting the skies as gallons upon gallons of fuel burn up in a matter of minutes. On their own, individual attacks like this might not mean all that much in the grand scheme of things, but added up, their effects have most certainly taken a massive toll on Russia's economy and its war machine. As a result, a huge fuel crisis is starting to spread far and wide across Russia, affecting numerous regions and multiple major cities, where people are being forced to pay extortionate prices and line up for hours to just get a tank full of gas. Many fuel stations in the affected regions have reduced service or imposed limitation due to shortages, and some have even been forced to shut down, while those that are still open are having to impose strict purchase caps and other restrictions to stop the crisis getting any worse. Ukraine shows no signs of stopping its attacks, and Russia has so far done a pathetic job of defending itself. As such, it appears the only option left is to call up reservists and task them with guarding the pipelines, factories and refineries that are still left standing. Vice Admiral Tsimlyansky went on to explain that the reservists will first need to undergo special training before being deployed to watch over important infrastructure locations. A draft law clarifies the purposes for which reservists are used, providing for the possibility of sending them to special training camps to protect vital infrastructure, energy, transport, oil refineries and other infrastructure only in their region. As the officer explained, a new draft law is being prepared by the Russian Ministry of Defense. According to official statements, this law will only allow for reservists to protect infrastructure locations, like transport hubs and oil refineries, in their regions and within Russia itself. the Kremlin appeared extremely eager to convey that this was not akin to a nationwide mobilization, and that reservists are in a very different category when compared to contract soldiers fighting on the front lines. The Vice Admiral went on to explain this point. In particular, I would like to point out that it's important not to confuse reservists with contract soldiers, active military personnel. The main difference between reservists and contract soldiers is that they can combine their time in the reserve with their primary employment. Reservists are not military personnel and have all the rights of civilians. Reservists are citizens who previously served in the armed forces or other security agencies and who voluntarily enter into a contract to serve in the reserves. So, if what the Vice Admiral is saying is to be believed, these reservists will be more like part-time National Guard. They'll continue to be allowed to live their lives, work their usual jobs, and remain connected to their families while serving, maintaining all the rights of a Russian civilian, but will also need to lend their time, energy, and military expertise to defending high-value locations from Ukrainian attacks. The Vice Admiral then doubled down on this point, specifically stating that the new draft law should not be seen as any sort of mobilization, and that mobilization was not even being talked about at this time. The draft law, developed on the initiative of the Russian Defense Ministry, does not affect all citizens and does not facilitate their conscription into military service, to special military operation zones, or deployment outside the country. Moreover, there is no talk of mobilization. If there's one thing that history has taught, it's that the words of the Kremlin officials cannot be trusted. They are masters of mistruth and propaganda and have a proven track record of saying one thing, then doing another. Thus, it's certainly possible that, despite the Vice Admiral's claims, this is in fact part of a larger strategy that could eventually prove to be a full-scale mobilization of the approximately 2 million reservists in the Russian ranks, who have all signed reservist contracts but are not usually obligated to serve. And even though the Vice Admiral also stated that these reservists will only be called on to defend their own territories and will not be dispatched to any special military operation zones like Donetsk, Luhansk, and other occupied regions of Ukraine, official statements reaffirmed that they will not be sent to these areas or outside of Russia. However, given Moscow's past flexibility with its own rules, questions remain about whether that policy could quietly change in the future, ultimately sending some or even all of these so-called reservists straight to the frontline territories. There are a few pieces of evidence backing up this possibility. Firstly, it wouldn't be the first time that Russia has blatantly lied about its true intentions. In fact, as previously mentioned, Putin's regime has made a habit out of saying one thing but doing the opposite, and recent history is littered with examples of this. On multiple occasions when speaking with US President Donald Trump, for example, Putin allegedly showed a willingness to end the war and spoke openly about negotiating some sort of ceasefire or peace agreement, only to bombard Ukraine with record-setting drone and missile attacks a day or two later. Before the war began, Kremlin officials also repeatedly claimed that there would be no war, that the rest of the world was lying and fear-mongering, and that Russia had no plans to send troops into the Donbas region. Vladimir Tsimlyansky, for instance, the former Russian ambassador to the European Union, said in January 2022, mere days before the invasion began. Russia has no plans to invade either Ukraine or any other country. It's a bluff created not in Russia, but in those countries that are now spreading this hysterical message across Europe and the world. Even the fact that Russia always refers to the war as a special military operation is another page from the same playbook. It's a way of weaponizing language, using the right words and terms to introduce ideas in a soft or gentle way, only revealing the full ugly truth at a much later date. The very same scenario may be playing out once more. First, the Kremlin could softly introduce this idea of reservists voluntarily taking arms to defend their regions. Then, a month or two down the line, it could make a second announcement, revealing that some of those valiant reservists are on their way to the front lines. The second piece of evidence to back up this possibility is the fact that the Vice Admiral seems so eager to stress that this wasn't a mobilization. In his address, he repeatedly brought up the concept that the reservists were completely different from contract soldiers, that they were purely there on a voluntary basis, and that they had signed contracts to serve their country. He appeared desperate to get the message across that this was all fair and reasonable, that nobody was being forced into service, and that those involved would only be stationed in locations across the Russian Federation and nowhere else. Of course, he may have been perfectly honest and upfront in what he said. But usually, whenever someone, especially a Kremlin official, keeps repeating and emphasizing the same ideas over and over, it's because they've got something to hide. They're desperate to convey a particular side of the story so that people don't ask too many questions or start having too many doubts. And that may be exactly what's happening here. There's no way of knowing for sure for the time being, but it's clear that the Vice Admiral was under strict orders to emphasize certain points and preempt possible concerns from the public. Only time will tell why the Kremlin was so eager to frame its announcement in such a specific way. But many analysts won't be surprised if these same reservists begin appearing in assaults on Pokros or other frontline locations in the not-so-distant future. In addition, don't forget that, in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, all of Ukraine belongs to Russia and should technically be classed as part of the Russian Federation. That's exactly what Putin said earlier this year, telling attendees at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum on June 20, "I've said many times that I considered the Russian and Ukrainian peoples to be one people. In this sense, all of Ukraine is ours. We have an old rule, wherever a Russian soldier sets foot is ours." So, the new draft law allegedly states that the reservists will only be deployed to locations within Russia. But Putin also says that all of Ukraine is technically part of Russia. Thus, it's easy to see how this whole reservist plan could be twisted into something more closely resembling a full-scale mobilization. And the third reason to back that up can be summarized in a single word: money. There's no doubt about it, the Russian economy is in freefall. The country was able to partially cushion the impact of Western sanctions and the enormous cost of fueling the war for the first couple of years, thanks to a lot of planning, preparation, and relatively smart moves on the Kremlin's part, like building up a strong war chest, strengthening trade relations with countries like India and China, and reducing Russia's reliance on Western imports and technologies, though inflation and extremely high interest rates have continued to weigh heavily on the economy. Now, however, as the conflict approaches its 4th anniversary, Russia is fully feeling the heat. Sanctions have slowly but surely taken a toll, cutting Russia's banks, businesses and elites off from international travel, trade and exchange. The value of the Russian ruble has become unstable, inflation and interest rates are sky high, recession is almost inevitable, and Ukraine's effective attacks on fuel sites and oil infrastructure have multiplied and magnified the Kremlin's financial woes in record time. In response, Russia is at last trying to find ways to cut costs wherever it can. It refuses to stop the war, and in many ways it can't even afford to do so, since so much of its money is now tied up in the military-industrial complex. But it does appear interested in slashing some of its more excessive areas of expenditure, and recruitment is likely to fall into that category. Even after suffering colossal casualties, with some estimates suggesting that Russia's total losses could be above 1.4 million by now, with close to 500,000 soldiers dead, the Kremlin continues to recruit heavily, bringing tens of thousands of new troops into the fold each month. But it's having to resort to increasingly desperate and expensive measures to maintain those numbers, offering huge cash incentives to entice citizens into signing up. A report from RE Russia, published earlier this year, found that Russia had spent just over 2 trillion rubles, $24.6 billion on manpower in the first half of 2025. That included 400 billion rubles for signing bonuses for new recruits, 860 billion rubles on service pay for the hundreds of thousands of active duty soldiers in Ukraine, and over 750 billion rubles more in compensation to the families of the dead and the wounded. If those rates stay the same for the rest of the year, then by the end of 2025, Russia will have spent more than 4 trillion rubles, close to $50 billion, just on recruiting troops to replenish its ranks, paying soldiers' salaries, and compensating their loved ones. That's the equivalent of 2% of Russia's entire GDP and almost 10% of the year's federal budget. It's an extraordinary amount of money, and with other reports revealing that Russia is spending around 2 billion rubles, $24 million every day, just on signing bonuses for new troops, it's easy to see how utterly unsustainable this system is. Thus, rather than continuing to shell out extravagant amounts of money to get new soldiers onto the battlefield, with many of them likely to be killed or wounded before they even have a chance of making any sort of impact, Russia's leaders may feel that it's much more cost-effective to make good use of their extensive amount of reservists. All they have to do is figure out some sort of legal loophole that gives them the power to deploy reservists to Ukraine, and this new draft law could do just that, according to analysts from the US-based Institute for the Study of War, ISW, which recently shared a detailed breakdown of the Kremlin's latest legislative actions, entitled warning: the Kremlin is preparing to mobilize reservists on a rolling basis to fight in Ukraine for the first time. In the report, the ISW explains that Russia's existing recruitment systems are losing momentum and proving too costly for the Kremlin to sustain. Russia's main method for generating manpower through high financial incentives and price surging is reportedly losing momentum and hitting diminishing returns as of October 2025. Russian military recruitment offices are failing to increase recruitment rates despite increasing payments, a tactic that has previously raised recruitment rates in 2023 and 2024. The Kremlin's current method of generating volunteers was already facing financial challenges as of early 2025. As a result, the Institute claims that Russia has been building up its strategic reserve for some time. A Russian insider source that has consistently provided accurate reports about changes in the Russian military command stated on September 21 that roughly 292,000 people signed contracts with the Russian MOD, and that some of these recruits are joining the strategic reserve. The new draft amendment, adopted on October 13, may provide the legal mechanism to activate elements of this reserve. The ISW goes on to share its view that the Kremlin will likely use this new draft law amendment to deploy active reservists into combat more rapidly than was possible under the previous mechanism that required a formal declaration of war or mobilization order. It adds that this method may help Russia in generating forces much more cheaply, saving money on signing bonuses and other recruitment costs, which may provide some light relief for the country's floundering economy. At the same time, the ISW notes that this approach could easily backfire on Putin, especially if large parts of the Russian public see through the lies and understand that reservists are being forcefully dispatched to Ukraine against their will. The Kremlin will likely invest significant resources in convincing the Russian people that reservists who deployed to Ukraine did so voluntarily. Compulsory military service remains unattractive and controversial, and Putin may face greater domestic political risks if the Kremlin fails to convince the Russian people that mobilized reservists killed in Ukraine went to Ukraine voluntarily. In short, the Kremlin is walking a very dangerous tightrope with this decision. Even if it only intends to use reservists to defend Russian territories for the time being, it's a plan that may prove pointless since Ukraine has already shown it knows how to bypass Russian defenses with its drones and missiles and will continue to strike at the Kremlin's oil infrastructure, transport hubs, and other important locations in the weeks and months to come. More Russian troops in and around those locations won't be enough to save them. If anything, it will only lead to more avoidable casualties and even greater losses for the country. If, however, Russia has bigger plans and intends to send these reserve troops all the way to Ukraine, it may have to deal with an increasingly angry and outraged public, many of whom are already sick and tired of the war and eager to see it come to an end. Now, learn more about how resentment, dissent, and even rebellion are beginning to rise up across Russian regions in this video, which looks at some of how Russia's indigenous peoples are starting to strike back at Moscow in more ways than one. Alternatively, for a closer look at what's happening within the walls of the Kremlin itself, watch this video, exploring how Putin's paranoia has triggered an unprecedented purge of Russian officials and put the president in the most precarious position of his entire career. And finally, subscribe to our channel too, and turn on notifications so you can be one of the first to learn about the latest biggest news and developments from the front lines of the Russia-Ukraine war and other important conflicts across the world.